everybody were to go vegan altogether, no more animal source foods whatsoever, that would reduce greenhouse gases in the United States by 2.6%. The total greenhouse gas footprint of all livestock in the United States is 4%. That's 4% of the total greenhouse gases. Okay. So I don't mean to deflect away from livestock. I just want to say, yes, while eating animal source food has an impact on climate, it is oftentimes overblown and in many cases a smokescreen.
Today I have with me Dr. Frank Mitloehner, a professor and air quality specialist in cooperative extension in the Department of Animal Science at UC Davis. Dr. Mitloehner received his master's degree in animal sciences and agricultural engineering, his PhD in animal science, and was the chairman of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. Dr. Mitloehner has authored or co-authored over 100 studies and is committed to helping our global community understand the environmental and human health impacts of livestock so that we can make informed decisions about the foods that we eat, all while reducing our environmental impact. Dr. Mitloehner, it's a pleasure to interview you. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I thought I would start with how do we even measure the resource used by animals and plants? Because this is something that I think is part of the nuance that is lost when you hear either, pro-beef, like carnivore diet zealots, or you hear like the vegan side, right? You hear this nuance lost, and like, what are we actually talking about when we think of what we're measuring?
Well, that's a good question. A very multifaceted question. So you mentioned that I chaired a United Nations FAO committee a few years ago, and the goal of that committee, with hundreds of scientists serving on it, was to develop a list of guidelines on how to measure the environmental footprint of livestock, because it's not just climate. Everybody talks about climate right now, but it's also surface water, groundwater, air quality, soil impacts, and so on. And for all of these different media, there are many different approaches as to how you measure impact. And so to cut through all of this murkiness and really get some clarity, we developed guidelines for all these different environmental variables, as I said. And so there's no short answer to your question other than it's very complex. There are now gold standard kind of techniques, technologies to do it, and people actually need to follow them.
What would you say are the ones that are focused on the most, like whether it be, gas emissions or whether it be like water use? Are those some of the main ones?
I would say currently the main focus is on greenhouse gases causing climate change, because livestock does emit a lot of methane. Mm-hmm. And so the main focus, particularly of those people who are critical to livestock, is centered around methane.
Got it. And we'll dive much more into methane pretty soon here. But before we do that, I want to kind of frame this episode based off of some plant-based arguments that I hear. Full disclosure, I people that listen to this podcast know that I am more animal-based. I tend to lean more towards that way, so that's my bias. Just putting it out there. And I want to begin with a piece that was actually written about you on a magazine called Undark, which I just saw today, which seems to be more of a plant-based leaning website. And their article is a good starting point for this. So let's start with their first claim, which is that there is a much greater greenhouse gas emission in animal, especially beef agriculture, than plant agriculture. And they cite Our World in Data to get those numbers. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's no question. That's true. Because you skip a trophic level if you forego animal source foods, because animals eat the plants and then we eat the animals, and so that's an entire trophic level. So it's a no-brainer that animal source food has a greater environmental footprint. The question is not whether or not that's the case, but the question is how much of really our impact on climate in a country like the United States is caused by what we eat. So for example, whether or not you eat a burger a week, or we're not talking about, eating it every day. I mean, who does? But whether you forego eating a burger a week and everybody else in this country doing the same, whether that has a measurable impact on climate. that kind of thing is a question. And here I would say, yes, it does, but the impact is so small that it's very hard to quantify it. Even if, as a nation, everybody, 330 million Americans, were to forego all animal source foods 1 day a week, such as a Meatless Monday would ask us to do, then we would reduce our carbon footprint by 0.3%. Now you can say, well, that's not nothing, it's something, and it is something. But it's certainly not something that is even close to the main culprit of human activity on climate, which is the use of fossil fuel, which is responsible for 80%, 80. So I don't mean to deflect away from livestock. I just want to say, yes, while eating animal source food has an impact on climate, it is oftentimes overblown and in many cases a smokescreen.
So if everyone in the United States was to say, all right, let's all go vegan, let's all go plant-based, it would have a very, very minimal impact on, is it global warming? Is that what is being measured?
Yeah, so I just cited the number 0.3% reduction of greenhouse gases for Meatless Monday. Okay, if everybody were to go vegan altogether, no more animal source foods whatsoever, that would reduce greenhouse gases in the United States by 2.6%. The total greenhouse gas footprint of all livestock in the United States is 4%. That's 4% of total greenhouse gases. Okay, just to give you a general number so that we have something as a reference point.
Okay. Okay. And does this data take into account the fact that in animal agriculture, I know in regenerative agriculture, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's some carbon fixation that goes back in because of the cows actually allow that to happen, right? So some of them will actually be carbon neutral or even like negative.
It does not take that into consideration. It only takes emissions into consideration, not so-called sinks. Sinks are processes that can reduce greenhouse gases. For example, soils and plants are important sinks for greenhouse gases. Approximately a third of human-caused carbon, a third of the carbon human activity puts into the air, gets stored in our soils. But it's important that we then leave those soils alone and don't plow them again, because otherwise we would release that carbon back into the atmosphere. The process I just referred to is called soil carbon sequestration. It's not included in this EPA inventory figure of 4% that I mentioned before.
Yeah, so that seems to be like a pretty misleading number, especially like if you look at popular films like Cowspiracy and you look at other kind of I guess vegan films where they cite these huge numbers that yeah.
Well, don't get me going on this. I mean, the thing is, I understand these people are well-meaning, oftentimes, unfortunately, ill-informed. But the folks around Cowspiracy have put really, really misleading stuff out, and I have confronted them directly. And since I have done so, they have changed some of their figures. Okay, that 51% that they cited in Cowspiracy as that being the impact of livestock on climate is grossly misleading. Okay, and the problem why I think that this kind of stuff is dangerous, not just bad, not just not scientific, but dangerous, is because we are taking the focus away from where it ought to be, which is the use of fossil fuels. And that is the use of transportation vehicles, the use of power plants, the use of everything that burns oil, coal, and gas. Okay, that is what causes 80% of our greenhouse gases. Yes, we can also make improvements on the food side, particularly at the farmer level, but we must not take away the focus from where the focus is supposed to be.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that because I'm a health coach, and so with my clients, I talk to them in terms of different healthy habits as big rocks and small rocks, right? You can move the big rocks and that'll give you the biggest bang for your buck. That's your sleep, that's your diet, that's your exercise, that's your stress management, that's your social connections, right? Those are the big things that'll have the biggest bang for your buck. And it seems to be pretty analogous, right, to fossil fuels being those big rocks, right? That you need to move those out of the way, because if we're focusing on this small, cattle or livestock, basically agriculture, that's going to have a very minimal impact, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very good analogy actually, because there are these large rocks, and the large rocks on the climate side are anything that uses oil, coal, and gas. And that can be the transportation sector, it can be power production and use. The cement industry is a very significant portion. These are the big rocks. And agriculture is a rock. It is a big rock too, but we need to eat. We must eat. Okay, that's not luxury. We must eat. And whether or not some people, some of your listeners like to see that the majority of the population likes to consume animal source foods, it is a fact. Okay, we don't live in some country where people be told what to eat, or who to vote for, or who to fall in love with, or other personal choices. These are personal choices
Right.
that are based on ethics and religion and preference and so forth. So I am very, very critical when I hear people saying, oh, from a logical perspective, we should eat this and that and the other and not whatever, because there are so many aspects that guide our choices in this field. And it's really nobody else's business. I mean, it is not different from saying everybody has the right to choose their own religion. Everybody has the right to choose their own partner. Everybody has the right to choose what they eat and drink. I mean, that is a personal choice in life. And I don't think anybody wants that to be taken away.
Right. Absolutely. And I think, going off of what you said about this being not only misinformation, but dangerous misinformation, is that there is a clear difference. And I had Dr. Peter Ballerstedt on the podcast earlier, right? He talked about the differences in protein quality between, an animal sourced protein and a plant-based protein. And it's really not comparable, right? When you look at them in terms of nutrition, this is also can be quite a dangerous thing, because not only is meat, specifically like ruminant meat, like lamb and cows, right? Those are great sources of the B vitamins, of so many different fat soluble vitamins, and including the part about increased digestibility of those proteins and much more complete proteins. You just can't compare the two. And if you're really going to force people in one direction and say you have to be vegan, otherwise you're killing the planet and you're a terrible person and all these other things, right? That's just not helpful for anyone, and it can be dangerous.
Yeah, what I'm most concerned about is if people were to say, well, I would have to pay more for my meat, I could deal with that. Okay, I have a good job. I could deal with that. But what I'm most concerned about is those people in society that are the poorest. They don't have a calorie issue by and large. Okay, many of the poorest people in our country are not undernourished with respect to being thin and starving to death, or starving every day. They normally have enough calories, but not enough nutrients. They are calorie rich but nutrient poor. And the most nutrient rich food that we know of are most animal source foods. And if you now go ahead like New York or other places and say, we now have a meatless, whatever, Monday or Friday or so, then you send these kids back to school on a day that's adjacent to the weekend where they didn't have nutrient dense food because they were at home. And then you expose them to a situation where 3-4 days of the week they don't have nutrient dense food. And that is then the case during the time when they most need it, namely during childhood. And that is really inappropriate in my opinion. If anybody were to take that away, that choice away from my kids, I would not be happy. I can assure you that much.
No, it's I mean, I hesitate to say something as severe as like a crime, but it seems to be, right, because there are studies now coming out which shows that a vegan diet remodels the metabolism of young kids, right? And it can change the way that their brain develops. It can change the way that their bodies develop if they're not getting some of those critical nutrients that you mainly get in animal food. So I totally agree with your point. Although many of these vegans are well-intentioned, they are misinformed, and they are, I think, leading us in a kind of a wrong direction.
I have to say, strongly feel that everybody has a choice to choose what they want to eat. Okay. And I have absolutely no beef with people saying I'm eating this or that, vegan or carnivore or anything in between.
Right.
As I said before, I think that's a personal choice. Where I get off board is when certain people who are in an extreme camp make these decisions about vulnerable parts of the population, the youngest and the oldest. That's when I really have a problem with it. Okay.
Yep.
They have specific nutritional needs, particularly around essential amino acids, as well as all different kinds of other essential nutrients such as iron and B vitamins and calcium and so on. And not just those nutrients, but these nutrients in a package that's particularly digestible and therefore bioavailable to our needs. And so if anybody takes that away from those who need it the most, then I have a major issue with that.
Shifting away from the bioavailability aspect of this, this article that I mentioned from Undark also criticizes how emissions are measured. It specifically criticizes this new scale that you and certain co-authors are advocating for, called the GWP Star, which would, according to them, would make methane emissions less problematic for global warming. So tell me about this scale and the origins of it.
Well, I have to say that the authors of this article are painfully uninformed about how greenhouse gases warm the planet. GWP Star is the name of this. It's called a matrix, a new matrix. What it does is it characterizes the actual warming impact of a gas such as methane. And it actually uses the old matrix GWP 100 in it. The new unit GWP Star uses the old unit GWP 100, but puts that into a perspective by using the GWP 100 variables and the changes over time, because that's really what is important. If you want to know whether or not warming occurs or cooling occurs or so, then that means you need to know different time points. Okay, so if you want to know, is it warmer today or cooler today than yesterday or last week, then you need to know what was the temperature last week and yesterday and today. And then you can say whether it was warmer or not, right?
Right.
If you only have today's temperature, you don't know if it's warmer today than it was yesterday or last week. You cannot. So that's what GWP Star does. Okay, it looks at methane concentrations in the air at different time points and then tells you whether or not the change over time has been in a way that it went up, down, or stayed constant. That's what GWP Star does. So the authors of this Undark article are really, I'm sorry to say that, and I'm critical now, but pretty clueless in this field. Now, something else I want to say is that the people who came up with this GWP Star were senior authors of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. They mentioned years ago that the old unit GWP 100 is very inaccurate when you have constant emissions of a certain source. Let's say the cattle herd in the United States were constant in numbers over the last 20, 30, 40 years, okay? Always about 100 million cattle. Then these constant cattle herds produce pretty much constant amounts of methane. And methane has something very special to it, namely that it's not just produced, but it's also naturally destroyed. And this old unit does not take the destruction of methane into consideration. It acts as if this gas were just produced but not destroyed. And so because of that, because of the omission of the fact that methane is also destroyed, this old unit GWP 100 overblows constant sources of methane by a factor of 4. Okay, the authors of GWP Star had told the world that for years now. And last August, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change in their AR6 report acknowledged that and said in writing that yes, if you use the old unit, you're overblowing the warming impact of constant sources by a factor of 3 to 4. For those of your listeners who don't believe me, AR6 report, page 123. So those people at Undark and others, they should read the IPCC in order to get confirmation on that.
And what are some other common myths that you hear surrounding cattle and livestock emissions and resource depletion?
Well, I oftentimes hear, for example, that we should forgo eating animals and instead eat plants directly, because that would save a lot of land. Okay, so we could use the land that we currently use for livestock for other purposes. That's a urban myth as well, because approximately 2/3 of all agricultural land, both in the world and also here in the United States, 2/3 of all agricultural land is the so-called marginal agricultural land. It's called marginal because you cannot grow crops there. But what grows there is cellulose. In other words, grasses. And the only animals that can digest that cellulose and convert it into something that then becomes useful for our nutrition are ruminants, meaning cattle, sheep, goats. They can eat cellulose and convert it into volatile fatty acids. Eventually, it becomes meat and milk. So without ruminant livestock, we could not make use of 2/3 of all agricultural land. The remainder 1/3 of all agricultural land is arable land, and that's where you can grow crops. So I think that's a very common argument as to why we should change what we eat. But all of that really is kind of a childish discussion if you think about it. I mean, it is not. It is just not the case that humans make the decision as to what they eat based on what is the best environmental argument, one way or another, right? When you go to the supermarket, or any of your peers, when you go to the supermarket, do you stand in front of all the shelves thinking about, which one has the lowest water footprint, the lowest greenhouse gas footprint, the best animal welfare, or which of those production processes are the best for agricultural workers, and so on and so on? I don't think so. I mean, some people claim they do that, and maybe they do so for a short while, but that is not what guides them throughout their lives. I think that we have to acknowledge that people have different food preferences for whatever reason. And yes, we can make improvements, and we should always improve processes around food production, just like we make advances in how we build cars and trains and buildings and so on. We should make our food as sustainable as possible. Okay, work with our farmers to make that happen, and reduce the environmental footprint to the greatest extent possible. But in my opinion, this whole topic is oftentimes just used in order to discourage people from eating animal source foods, because prior to using the climate argument, the same people who argue that way today used an animal welfare or animal rights or some other argument before. The arguments have changed, but their intent remains the same, which is to end animal agriculture. And that's where they are a very small minority, and actually a tiny minority, and I find that interesting too, in their vast majority, go back to eating a more omnivore diet after about a year. About 80% plus stay vegetarian and vegan for about a year, and then they revert back. And these are numbers that come from that particular area of food preference. So to me, if that were a gold standard we should all aspire to, then people would stick to it and stick to it forever. Most of them don't.
Right. Yeah, I've heard those similar statistics as well. Regarding water expenses, which is something that I briefly mentioned at the beginning, which is something that oftentimes you just hear this kind of very narrow-minded approach to sustainable eating, which oftentimes that means that water consumption is neglected. So how do water expenses play into this conversation of sustainable eating?
Yeah, water is a big topic, particularly here in the West where I live. We have water scarcity, and there's just no question around it. And some food items are much thirstier than others. For example, it takes about 2 gallons of water to grow one single walnut, about a gallon per almond nut, individual nut. Okay, so it takes Also quite some water to produce milk and meat and so on. And so we do have to acknowledge that, and we do have to work on ways to making our agricultural goods to growing them as efficiently on the water side as possible. And we have made huge improvements, for example, by doing drip irrigation, where you have lines underground that only give as much water as the plant needs to grow. You have less evaporation happening and so on. What happens very often on the livestock side is that numbers are put out that are just horrendously high, okay, horrendously high. And years ago, even though I'm not into water research, I talked to colleagues who are, and they told me, well, what people are counting is all the water that is used to grow all the feed these animals eat. And I said, yeah, okay, but let's say a beef animal is at least 2/3 of its life on pasture. Okay? All beef animals that we ever consume, even if they're corn finished, they spend the first 2/3 of their lives on pasture. And so obviously pastures are not irrigated. So does that mean that the people who make these calculations count rainwater? And the answer was absolutely, yes, they do. I said, but the rain would fall onto that land no matter what. The rain would fall on that land no matter what, whether there's a cow on there or not. The rain would fall there. And if the cow now eats some of that forage that grew on that land, then that water will go in form of the feed, but a few hours later it'll be excreted again. So it's not that it magically disappears because the cow has eaten it and therefore internalized it for a couple hours. But that's the kind of math people do, okay? And that's, in my opinion, that's a problem. So there's blue water, there's gray water, and there's green water. Blue water is tap water, and that's what we really have to make sure we don't waste. But green water is rainwater, and that water will fall no matter whether people are there or not there, whether cows are there or not, and so on.
Yeah, when I was looking through some of your other interviews, this concept of green water it's kind of mind-blowing that gets lost in translation sometimes, and is not something that is taken into account, because I think you mentioned in a previous video that it was 94% of the water requirements needed to actually grow a lot of these cattle and livestock. So that's pretty incredible.
Yeah, it's the vast majority for sure.
Yeah. Now, regarding animal feedlots versus grass-fed, I know this is something that I think you have a very interesting perspective on. What are your thoughts on the differences in the environmental impact of both of those?
Yeah, so I don't want to come across as saying the one is good, the other one is bad. But the notion that a production style that includes a feedlot is inherently worse for climate, for example, that is just flawed. And here's the reason why. What a feedlot does, so first of all, for those of your listeners who don't really know the difference, there's a very small percentage of beef in the United States that is finished on pasture. Okay, that's grass finished. The vast majority of beef that we consume in the United States is corn finished. And what is the difference? The difference is that a grass-finished animal lives about 26 to 30 months of age, so approximately 2.5, 3 years, and then is slaughtered. A corn-finished animal also lives the majority of its life on pasture, but it's slaughtered when it's around 14 to 16 months of age, so 1.5 years of age approximately. So first, they all live with their mom on pasture in a cow-calf operation, and then the grass-finished animals stay there. The corn-finished animals eventually, for the last 4 to 6 months of their lives, go into feedlot, where they are fed something else, namely a so-called concentrate-rich diet, which is a corn-rich diet. Corn or distillers grains or other concentrate feeds. But they stay in there in the feedlot for 4 months, okay, approximately. While they're in a feedlot, they are producing the smallest amount of greenhouse gases of their entire life. And the reason is that the microbes in their stomach system, in their rumen that produces the methane, those microbes require roughage in the diet. Another word for roughage is fiber. The more fiber, the more methane is produced. These methane producing microbes, also called methanogens, require fiber in the diet, roughage in the diet to produce methane gas. In a feedlot, only 10 to 15% of the diet is roughage. On pasture, almost all of it is roughage. So yes, it's true. Of course, a feedlot finished animal will need feed that is grown someplace else, maybe corn or distillers grains or so, and that feed needs to be shipped. But even if you include all of those emission sources in a so-called life cycle assessment, which accounts for the entire life cycle of, let's say, grass finished versus beef versus corn finished animal, the corn finished animal actually has a lower and not higher carbon footprint. So that's not to say that there's nothing wrong with feedlot systems. There are people who find it objectionable that animals are not on pasture. They don't like to see cattle in a dirt floored corral. They just don't like it. And if you take the right angle and so on in a feedlot, then you can take a shot of animals that are cramped. But the average space per beef animal in a feedlot is between 130 to 150 square feet. Okay, that's the average space each animal has. The reason why you see them cramped is because they're herd animals. Okay, they will bunch up. They do not want to be all spread out nice and even. That's what people think they should do, but that's not what they want to do. They are prey animals and they bunch up. That's what they do. So the discussion is multifaceted, okay, in many, many ways. I can talk to you for a long time just about the comparison of grass finished versus corn finished. But the fact remains, the vast majority of people, of consumers who consume beef, do prefer the taste of the corn finish because it leads to a different kind of fat characteristic. And it is a much younger product. Okay, so it's 14 to 16 months for corn finished versus 26 to 30 months for grass finished. So that has an impact on tenderness of the meat.
Okay, so we left off on talking about the impact of animal feedlots versus grass-fed, and I have to say that, you know, at the beginning when I first started getting into all this health stuff, I thought, no way, I mean, grass-fed is way better for everything. It's better for nutrition. It's better for, and I mean, I feel like I was one of those people that was scaremongering of feedlots. But now that I've seen some of your work, I've talked to, you know, Dr. Peter Ballerstedt and others. It seems to be that this kind of fear surrounding animal feedlots is kind of exaggerated.
Yeah, I think it is largely an emotional issue. Okay, so the feedlots had been designed really to maximize efficiencies. But what comes with efficiencies is environmental footprint. Okay, if you improve efficiencies, then that comes along with an improvement of environmental footprint. And so, and that improved efficiency has everything to do with you are shortening the lifespan of those animals drastically. I mean, drastically, but you arrive at a product that the consumer prefers. And at the end of the day, that's what sells the product. Okay, so when people decide, do I have beef tonight, or do I have pork tonight, or chicken, then it's taste that rules. And if people say, I really like that product and I like to barbecue it or so, then that's the way it goes. And the farmers respond to the signals that the market sends.
Right.
Okay? So I mean, it is not the most romantic image, you know, the image of a feedlot. I understand that. And the animal agricultural sector has over years and years marketed beef always with animals in a pastoral environment. And so people have that in their head that that's the way it should be, and that's the only way it should be. But with their pocketbook, they decide differently. With their pocketbook, they decide differently, okay, because they have figured out what it is that they prefer, normally taste rules and price rules too, because I mean, grass finished beef is more expensive if you consider that it's a small niche market, it is more expensive in many
Right.
cases. And so people are cost sensitive, and they are very much into knowing and then following their taste patterns.
To finish off here, I know a large part of your work now is in reducing the environmental impact and also making food more sustainable. So, what are some of the steps that you're currently taking and researching to do that?
So the center of my research is around limiting the environmental footprint, and particularly the air impact of livestock. And so I find ways to minimize ammonia, minimize greenhouse gases, minimize other air issues around livestock. And what's really great is that a gas like methane, we already talked about methane, is kind of different compared to other gases. It has a very short lifespan, and because of its short lifespan, a unique angle with respect to being a lever in reducing our impact on climate. If you reduce methane, you have an instantaneous impact on climate. And if you reduce methane strongly, 30–40%, then you can get an industry to a point where it becomes climate neutral. Because a strong reduction of methane equals a strong reduction of warming. And if this methane reduction is strong enough, it can offset other greenhouse gases from the same sector, such as nitrous oxide and CO2, getting this industry to a point where they become climate neutral. Okay, and this is a goal that all industries, particularly in Europe right now, are striving for, becoming climate neutral, and entire countries want to become climate neutral.
Mm-hmm.
And the Paris Climate Accord is all about that, right? Limiting our impact on warming such that we don't exceed a 2 degrees centigrade additional warming. So my goal is to do what we need to do on the livestock side to achieve strong methane reductions. Here in California, we have achieved about 30% reduction, 30% reduction of methane, which is nothing short of sensational, through the use of public-private partnerships. The state incentivizing reductions of methane on farms and working hand in hand with farmers to achieve those reductions, because they have such a great punch on the climate side. And so that makes me very hopeful. It makes me very bullish, no pun intended. But it does make me very bullish because I can see that our farmers can be part of a climate solution. And this is not some greenwashing. The use of a unit like GWP Star, not some kind of creative accounting, but instead it's the use of the best science that we know of to help farmers do their share in making our climate better and our environment more sustainable.
Now, what are some of the practical strategies that you've used to actually make that happen? Like, I know I've read into Joel Salatin's work, and I think a large part of what he advocates for is regenerative agriculture. Is that the way forward, or is it some other types of strategies?
So regenerative agriculture is not my area of emphasis, okay? And I don't know enough about it with respect to having seen real research results, but what it largely centers around is improving soil health. Okay, that's largely what this is about. To preserve soil as what it is, namely a very large sink of greenhouse gases, and make it even a larger sink. And what exactly the impacts of that, what exactly those impacts are, remains to be seen, has not been conclusively quantified. But reductions of methane, for example, are studied and already implemented extensively. So, for example, here at UC Davis, in my department, Animal Science, we've done dozens of studies on feed additives. Additives added to the diet of animals that drastically reduce enteric methane being the methane that's belched out by these ruminants. We have found that reductions anywhere between 10 to 50% are possible for beef and dairy cattle, for sheep and goats. That's on the enteric side. The manure of those animals also produces methane. And here we have found that if you cover the lagoon where the manure is stored on dairies, If you cover that waste storage area, then the gas that normally would go into the air is captured, and it's called biogas. Okay, it's a mixture of various gases, and 60% of that biogas is methane. 60% of that biogas is methane. These farmers now capture that biogas, clean it up, and make it into transportation fuels for semi-trucks and buses, called renewable natural gas, RNG. This pathway of dairy biogas from these lagoons, this pathway of dairy biogas converted into this renewable natural gas, this transportation fuel, is considered by the state of California as the most carbon negative fuel type there is. And that's a really good thing. Carbon negative means it's most dissimilar to fossil fuels. Okay, so it's the greenest fuel type there is. And as a result, the state is paying so-called low carbon fuel standard credits, low carbon fuel standard credits to farmers that do that. And these low carbon fuel standard credits are so high that we have a new gold rush in the state of California, namely one of dairy farmers covering their lagoons, converting biogas into transportation fuels. And these transportation fuels are then going into trucks, buses, replacing diesel. And so this has reduced, this alone, this one technology alone, has reduced methane from California dairies by 25%. And it just started a few years ago. This is nothing short of sensational.
That's incredible. I never heard of that before.
Yeah. So, but
Wow.
that's the way it is. The goal of the state of California is to reduce methane by 40%, 40. Our dairy sector is already over halfway there with 25%. And so I'm very optimistic I'm very optimistic in my belief that this sector and other livestock sectors will achieve these climate goals.
And to finish off here, where can people find out more about you and your work?
So I'm the director of the CLEAR Center, CLEAR, CLEAR Center here at UC Davis. And if you want to read up more, blogs, explainers, YouTube videos, and so on, you find it on the center's webpage, which is clear.ucdavis.edu. And I'm also on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @GHGGuru.
Awesome. I'll be linking to those in the show notes. I really appreciate your time. This was awesome.
Thank you so much for having me.